Hello, I'm Cara Dahl Russell. Thank you so much for joining me in a presentation of my talk, Programming Your Program, How to Make Your Solo Program More Interesting from the perspective of a classical music radio host. I was invited to be a presenter and speaker at the 4th annual Christopher Newport University Harp Festival in late March of 2021. So now I'm sharing basically that same information, but in a slightly more expanded format. I had time constraints, so I had to keep things very brisk and very brief. Despite having an hour, as brief as an hour could be. So this will be longer than that, and I'm going to break it up into sections. If you have signed up for this talk, this is being presented on YouTube, but you have to sign up for it and get the link from me. So thank you for doing that. And by now you should have received the PDF document that goes along with this talk, because there are a couple visuals that are on that document, as well as just a reiteration of the main points so that you don't have to take copious notes while we chat together about this. So I was invited to speak because of the weird combination of my background. Over 40 years as a professional union actress, directing, a classical music radio host and programmer, a writer, and a pre-concert lecturer, as well as being adjunct professor of harp at Salisbury University and teaching harp privately, and of course performing with orchestras, ensembles, and just gigging around in general. So all of those things have been components of my gig life as a harpist and as a musician. I also teach beginning cello. This combination has helped me to become known for creating inventive and interesting harp performance programs. I hope to share some of my insights with you to help you inform your choices as you put your programs together. Some of you will know I was scheduled to do this talk last year until the precautions for the pandemic pushed everything aside, canceled events, and changed all of our lives. But ironically, this makes this topic even more relevant now, when the biggest international concert names are doing online recitals and begging for Patreon subscriptions. We each have to do what we can to make what we do as distinct as possible. And the good news is we can all do that by having your program be true to yourself, as true to your whole self as possible. And by adding in time-tested performance skills that are too frequently totally absent in music recitals and performances. So it's a great time for us to have this talk, and hopefully I can share some tools and some ideas to help you make your programs more interesting. I will be focused mostly on classical works, old and new. And yes, even with the high rate of streaming today, I will be talking and focused most on a CD or album format, simply because that CD format has a direct analogy to a performance program format. The planning and flow of a compelling CD is really synonymous for a compelling performance. And as you know, many performers are recording their programs to become a CD. Bonnie Raitt said, "I believe in the concept of the CD or album, of the idea of sitting down for 45 minutes and taking a journey with someone," unquote. So now, raise your hand. You're alone. Raise your hand if you're that person who has played harp since you were 6 or before, excels at technically astounding repertoire, performs internationally as a concert soloist. There may be a couple of you watching, and if you are, I know there are a couple things you can pick up from this too. But that's definitely not me. I'm an actress and a singer that started playing the harp later in life, and guess what? That's okay. I am the poster child for adult learning and restarting many times in different phases of a career. And I definitely don't have the youth, the beauty, or the prowess that most classical music agents look for in a concert artist luminary. But I still have plenty to offer an audience, and so do you, pretty much wherever you are. The one thing we all have in common, all of us who were there on the day at the Christopher Newport University Harp Festival, and all of us who are here today, no matter what our level is, we're still working at it. We're continually growing and improving. And that's life. That's what life is all about. So hopefully by now you either have a link on, I don't know what device you're watching this on, you have a link to the handout, or you have already downloaded it and printed it out. So, because there will be some visual references on that handout as we talk. And I guess I should start with a few caveats up front. Of course, there are times when you play when the structure of the performance is absolutely not up to you or the selection. Sometimes there's required material and a mix of repertoire that simply isn't easy to fit together in an entertaining way. So I'm not addressing orchestra work, ensembles, scholastic recital performances, or competitions. And the second point is, I will warn you that definitely some of my observations and perceptions, the things that I say, may be things that either you or your teacher doesn't want to hear, and they may actively disagree with, or you may actively disagree with, and I ask you to entertain the ideas, to think about them, and not just have a forget that response, but think about it and really try to understand what I'm saying, because some of the issues I'm addressing are quite complex, and to ponder them and blend these with what you work on as they apply to you. So I'm going to take a step back and explain a little bit about my experiences as a classical music radio host and programmer. My experiences were unique in that I have a multifaceted background in the arts, and I was able to make connections between the arts and the music. I was also extremely lucky that I held my position during a time of financial and personnel transition and turmoil at the station where I worked. And that meant that I was almost entirely free to program as I liked. And I was free to break some really very long-held traditions in classical music programming. When I worked at the station, every day of every week, mostly on my own time, I was reviewing new classical CD releases that were sent to the station. The vast majority were solo piano, at least 7-1 solo piano. There are just that many proficient, accomplished pianists out there. Then solo violin, solo brass and wind, solo guitar in numbers that are still growing. And of course, I was always very happy when I received a new harp CD, either solo or ensemble, to review. I was also very lucky that I inherited a weekly 3-hour new release program and blog, which means that over 6 years, I listened to at least 6,000 new classical release CDs. And I interviewed artists, and I got to talk to PR people and to studio label representatives, and also to people who were doing distributions of CDs to stations with PR. So you learn a lot about the business, and from the CDs themselves, you learn a lot about how to put a program together and how not to put a program together. Internally, there was a shorthand we had for a CD that was just work to sit down and listen to, no matter how brilliant the playing. And we called it a recital CD. You could start by looking at the CD and you see the predictable list of pieces. Most radio programs won't even listen to that. I did, but I'm a musician and most programmers are not. And often these CDs were just that, the recording of a recital. So the playing might very well be exquisite, but the program itself lacked cohesion or interest. The pieces were the same required pieces that are played by hundreds of other people. These pieces were already, more importantly, already in the library at the station, performed by international stars. So it didn't fill a gap in the station's library. Which brings us to a hard truth. Most stations have no interest in playing your recording of something when they can program the same piece played by an internationally recognized name. Now, an exception would be a station that has a new release program, as the one that I worked on. And I'm not saying it's impossible, but because I know that you as an artist, if you want to do a national distribution to the classical music stations in the United States, you can pay $4,000 to $5,000 to have your CDs distributed to classical music stations in hopes that they will listen to it and air your music. You have to be aware of the odds. Your selections need to stand out. So that's where I'll start, is your selections. When you do have a program where you are able to create a new program, it's not a competition, it's not a recital, there are no required pieces. How do you create something that's more interesting? And it starts from your very first selection. So let's start at the beginning. Now up here, I have a link to a piece of music that I played a portion of when I gave the talk, but I encourage you, listen to the whole piece. Try to let go of the details and think of the music itself, the piece itself. And if you are attending a program, and this is the opening piece, Air Grave, a dance from the opera Zoroastra by the composer Jean-Philippe Rameau. If that is the opening piece, what does this piece tell you or lead you to expect from the program to come? So now click on this, and I'll assume a pause here for you to listen to that piece of music. Thank you for listening to that. Now that piece has full section repeats, and it's my own transcription of that piece from the score of Zoroastra by Jean-Philippe Rameau. So if that is the first piece you hear in the program, think of some adjectives or ideas of what you might expect from the rest of the program. Are you expecting a certain tone, a certain style? Does the fact that the composer is Rameau lead you to expect more Baroque music? Does the fact that it's from an opera tell you anything? Does the fact that it's a dance tell you anything? My point is, whether right or wrong, your first selection sets up an expectation. It is your musical first impression on your program. Then it's up to you as to whether you fulfill that expectation or you completely change things up and bust it wide open. Programming is about that interplay between individual pieces. And at the same time, it's about the flow created of the whole. If you are being intentional in how you put these things together, you can, like a radio host, introduce the next piece, sometimes with only a few words, that helps the audience transition, helps them to follow with you and track with you mentally. And that, keeping the audience with you, is what builds interest and connection and attention. And coincidentally, that's also the same thing that builds a following for a performer. And so it goes with the whole program. And so that's what I did for every hour of every day of programming, 5 hours each day on air. I had breaks at the top of each hour, so that gave me markers I had to work with. But I had, for myself, a larger goal. I never do things the easy way. My goal was to create a cohesive flow for the whole 5 hours of each day, but also within each hour, creating a mini program for each one of those hours that also created a whole flow of a 5 hours. And I was rewarded in that in a small town in Maryland, we had listeners from New York calling to support the station and saying that I had the best classical music programming on the East Coast, which was not a compliment I took lightly because I know there's some fabulous hosts out there. So I'm going to pause here as the break for our first session, and never mind. No, I'm not. I'm going to continue. So I'm going to break down selections a bit more as we talk about choosing these individual selections. A, variety. Consider all of the elements of each piece, the length, the tone, the complexity of the piece, the time period, and strive for variety because variety breeds interest. Also, if you're able to, add another instrument for one or two pieces, either yourself playing something different or have a friend join you for one or two pieces. If you sing, toss in a song or toss in a sing-along. Andre Rieu has this down. He gets his whole audience singing. It gets them feeling as if they are in something together with each other and with you, the performer. Variety gives everyone a break and keeps the audience awake and engaged with you. And by the way, the Vienna Philharmonic has done some sing-alongs too. So engagement with you is from the variety, which leads to something we don't always like to hear as musicians. Audiences love what they already know. Now, we know this on a core level because we know it from the responses to pieces. We know which pieces are war horses that everybody likes. But the reality is, any music that is not well known is new music to the general audience member. Unfortunately for us as harpists, most harp repertoire is foreign to the average audience listener. We can name the 5 pieces that most people know. Mozart Concerto for Flute and Harp, the Handel Concerto, Debussy Dances Sacré and Profane, Ravel Introduction Allegro, possibly the Bourdieu Concerto. These are the pieces that the average audience member knows of the concert harp repertoire. Basically, any other piece, no matter how much harpists know it, basically any other harp piece is new music to the average listener. Now, you can play anything as long as you remember to break up selections into well-known and lesser-known variety. Now, I admit it, my personal taste is for things that are pretty darn obscure, but I always mix these with things that are much more familiar. And this is exactly why both Salcedo and Grajany did so many transcriptions from piano and keyboard works. Almost any given piano transcription is simply more familiar than any work written exclusively for harp. So familiarity. C, melody. I got into a mild argument on air with the then head of the Curtis Institute when he was insisting that you can make an audience love the Hindemith Violin Concerto. Quite frankly, that's bull. I know I've had listeners tell me that when they hear the name Hindemith announced, they turn off their radio. These are classical music listeners. And some of them will say that they won't go to a recital if Hindemith is scheduled. It's not that they wouldn't go to the recital, it's just they are not quite as likely to show up if they have season tickets, for example. And I'm not singling out Hindemith. I mean, we as harpists are lucky that our Hindemith piece is not abrasive. But it's a lot of work, and it's not known to people. So, and it has that name that a lot of your more versed listeners aren't anxious to hear. So you have to be aware of that. In the early 1900s, in the midst of deconstructionism, one composer said, "Melody is how the human heart attaches to music." Now, before you think I just don't like new music, I regularly perform in a new music concert, and I find it fascinating to work on and engaging. We have a small but committed audience that is up for an entire evening of new music, but that's not your average audience. I do, in my performances, play a good bit of new music, but I also know even a 2-page piece of dissonant or very strange music can wear an audience out. You can feel them shifting in their chairs and looking at their watches, and they start clearing their throats. No matter how engaging your performance, again, you can select any of this material, but do it with an awareness. If you consider each of your pieces for its melodic component, and then again consider which pieces are placed next to each other. Keep this varied within the program. And those moments of melody keep listeners more engaged. D, simplicity is part of accessibility for an audience member. New works, unfamiliar works, large, lengthy concert works that require a great deal of focus and energy from an audience. Interspersing these with easier and more familiar pieces, sometimes very simple pieces, what some of us call musical candy, gives the audience a break. I continue to be surprised at how often, after a performance, an audience member will come up and mention the simplest piece that I played as the one that they really loved. So I urge you to reconsider every single one of your competition pieces or required works in performance programs. These pieces are not being selected because they are pieces everyone loves. They are being chosen for other technical merits. And you just have to be really aware of that if you're choosing one of these for a live performance. Make it the one. Make it the one. If you don't believe me, how about Robert Schumann? Endeavor to play easier pieces with elegance. Now, practicing what I preach for this year and this, still kind of holdover COVID time period, I've taken this as my personal mantra, and I still have a couple big works that I'm working on and keeping my repertoire fresh, but I'm intentionally taking a step back to work on some sets of easier repertoire and to play them with technique and nuance and feeling. And I have to say, it's been a revelation, both about my playing, but also about the repertoire itself. And I highly recommend this kind of step back as a focus for a set period of time, maybe even a whole semester worth of time, even if you're not in school, you know what I mean, a semester. If you don't believe Schumann, how about Catherine Michel? She was interviewed by Alexander Boldychev, and right now I'll stop and say, if you haven't been watching his interviews with other great harpists, they're must watch. You always learn something fascinating from them. Catherine Michel recounted how Michel Legrand gave her the advice, play what is accessible, when they began working together. Of course, she can play these marvelous showpieces, but with Legrand, she began to explore more popular music, and that eventually also led to her making several recordings of intermediate pieces that she feels are both musically worthwhile and are starting to be overlooked as viable repertoire. So if she can focus on these and make them the central feature of recordings, certainly that gives you the leeway to say, oh, I can step back and I can revisit these things, or find some of the things I didn't play when I was an intermediate player, and look for those that are engaging and worthwhile and have musical merit as well. So now you understand that each selection says something, and how the juxtaposition of the pieces also says something, and each individual pairing and what follows which, and all the elements that go in to choosing those selections to create the most interesting group of selections as a whole. And now we can move to, and this time I will switch over, this will be the next talk. I'll talk about the overview of your program. And you don't have to start from scratch. These are some long-term things that have been known within the whole of the entertainment industry, and I'll talk about those in the second talk. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you continue exploring this with me. And even if you only watch one of these, I hope you get a little tidbit that helps you think about how you're putting your next program together to make it more interesting and engaging. And I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.